Hello and welcome back to the basement. In this episode, I'm going to build a bass guitar. This has been a long time coming. I've done many projects on this channel, which is not necessarily what I set out to do. I was going to originally start doing gear reviews, but then I realized I wasn't having much joy in that. And there's so many other people that do that and do that very well. I didn't feel like I had anything new to contribute. What I did feel like I was inspired to do was to do bass guitar related projects. So if you've been following the channel at all, I've done a bunch of little ones. Now it's time to get into a big one, a real big one. But before I get into the actual build, I want to give a little bit of a history on how I got to this point where I wanted to attempt to build a custom instrument from scratch. It's all inspired by just watching YouTube videos. I mean, that's really it. At some point, a recommended video popped up in my feed from Crimson Custom Guitars on the Clarity Walnut guitar build, which is a Clara Walnut Les Paul style inspired guitar for the guitar player for King Crimson, built by Ben Crow. That was the first time I'd ever really seen anybody make an instrument from scratch, and I didn't really even consider it that it was a thing. And then it just sent me on down a rabbit hole, and I came across so many other makers that were just building incredible things. And ultimately, I decided, you know what, I'm going to do that. So several years ago, or 2 years ago, I sketched up a couple of prototype models that I was interested in building, and I let it sit. And I let it sit, and I let it sit. All along the while, I was taking on projects and sharing them on my YouTube channel of me learning how to do things that would ultimately land me at this point where I was ready to make this attempt. And at some point, I just felt like, okay, my first instrument is not going to be perfect. It may not even be good, but I need to at least try. So that's where we're at. That's how I got here, and that's where this thing came from. So if you've been paying attention, you've seen this in the background on my last video. It was on the bass guitar rack. And I think I actually played this in the sound demo for the DIY fuzz pedal kit that I put out a while ago. This bass was built February of 2023. Yeah, February 2023 is when I built this. So it is now February 2024 when this first episode is coming out. And I gotta say, a year after this thing was built, I'm still happy with it. I still love this instrument. It may not be my number one go-to, because it's just one tool of many. And, you know, aesthetically, I get it. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and that's fine. This was the vision that was in my head, and I wanted to see if I could bring it forth into reality. And I kind of did. So let's go through the process. I've had a lot of fun editing these 496 clips in over a terabyte of footage. This is not going to be a single episode. This is going to be a series, but I'm going to try and keep the episode count to a minimum and cram as much into 30-minute episodes as I possibly can. So I don't know how many episodes it's going to be, but here's episode 1. Let's get after it. All right, we're off to the races, starting with the template. If you saw the date on that hand scribbled drawing, I drew that in May of 2021 and finally started building it at the end of 2022 and finished it finally in February of 2023. So I'm starting with making a template. I'm using some 3/8 inch MDF to make the body template. This is the first time I've ever made a body template. I kind of agonized over the shape for quite a while to get that sketch drawn out on the MDF. And you see I roughed it out on the bandsaw, and then I'm taking it over to the oscillating spindle sander to refine the edges. And this is what I end up with. So now I go into trying to figure out the piece of wood that I'm going to use. So I have 2 slabs of locally sourced maple. I don't know what species of maple. I think this is silver maple, but it's not a hard maple.
And what I'm trying to figure out is which piece of the slab do I want to use? Do I want to use the prettiest piece on my first instrument, or do I want to use the crappiest piece? So I go back and forth for a while, draw out the template on multiple pieces, and then I decide to put that aside and start getting going on the neck blank. So I opt to do a 5-piece laminate neck. I'm using some scrap maple and some scrap sapele. And all this wood came in essentially a 1,000-pound pallet that I bought from a local mill that does like architectural stuff and trim moldings and just custom building materials out of local and exotic woods. So they have all these offcuts when they're getting their material into dimensional sizes for their projects, and they bundle them up and sell them on occasion. So I literally picked up a ton of wood, and a lot of it was triggered by the fact that there was some sapele in there, and there was also a couple small pieces of maple. So this entire neck is coming from that lot of wood. So after I kind of got everything to rough size, I start mocking up how I want to start stacking the layers of the 5-piece laminate, and then I'm running it through the thickness planer to make sure that all the pieces of the sapele are the same thickness and all the pieces of the maple are the same thickness. And for being on the lower end of jointer planer combos, this little jet, it actually does pretty okay, especially with fresh knives on it. And I think I've got fresh knives on it for this particular build, luckily. Now it's time for the glue up. And I use a ton of glue, as you should for a neck glue up. Now I find with the amount of glue that I'm putting on here, I don't necessarily need to put glue on both surfaces. And a lot of folks do that, but I put such a thick layer on the one side that's plenty, and just in my experience with other projects that I've done it that way on, I've not had any issues, and a year after this base was built, still no issues. So I start going through the clamping up process, all the while trying to mitigate glue squeeze out with wet paper towels, and quickly realized that my strategy of hopefully using my C-clamps, well, that wasn't going to work. So I start scrambling and finding literally every clamp of any length I can get my hands on before this glue starts to set. Every woodworker will tell you there's no such thing as enough clamps. This is why these slabs were so cheap. He tried to fix them, but didn't work. So I think what I can do is I can use that as a body core, or as I can use it as tops, drop tops. Either way, I feel like I can mill it down. So this particular slab has got a really cool piece of crotch wood right there that if I do my body right here as I've outlined, that'll eliminate that cool crotch figure. So I really needed to look at doing it down here, which means I may have to do some sort of a top. We'll see. So obviously I'm agonizing over what piece of what slab I want to use to make this body. This is the thinner of the two slabs. And I'm afraid that if I use this particular slab, by the time I go to flatten it out, I may not have enough thickness to do a single piece body. So I start mocking up and tracing out everywhere that the slab could land, or the body could land. And I decide to end up going with the other slab. Now here I'm realizing that I might need to make some adjustments to the template to accommodate the neck pocket, because I cut it off kind of flat and flush with the horns, where the horns kind of go in. And I'm looking at this ESP LTD 5-string bass that I have. It's a B205 SM. I like the way the neck joins with the body. I like the 6-bolt design, and I like the way that the body actually kind of protrudes out between the horns to make a longer and stronger neck pocket. So I decided I'm going to emulate that, and it's going to start off by striking a center line on the template, trying to square it up between 2 squares, just trying to make sure that I'm measuring off of the same spot on the body to find center. I'm not sure this is the best way to do it, but that's what I ended up doing, and ultimately I got a fairly decent result. So I'm using a center finding ruler, and I think that's the key. So I'm just making sure I'm finding center between those 2 pieces, and that's what I'm using the squares to do. So now I've got the center line established. I'm not worried about where I drew the neck pocket, because I know that wasn't precise. That was just a mock-up. And now I'm trying to decide how far back within the body I want to set the neck before I start running into issues with pickup placement. Because I want to use, at least for the bridge pickup, I want to use a standard, or I'm referencing this 2000 made in Mexico Fender Jazz bass for the neck position pickup. So just taking a bunch of careful measurements to make sure that I don't make the neck joint go so far back into the body that it screws with the positioning of the neck pickup. So once I establish that, then I start permanently reattaching that offcut back onto the template after I figure out, where that neck joint extension is going to go. And I end up tracing out the bottom of a coffee cup to make that radius. Nice. So a bunch of CA glue and some accelerator. Apparently I was down to the bottom of that bottle of accelerator. And then I go to the bandsaw to rough that out. All right, so this is the thicker of the 2 slabs. I figure I'm going to have the most margin of error when I go to flatten the slabs with this one. And I end up going with just one end, and I stop trying to overanalyze which part of the slab I'm going to use as far as how pretty what piece of grain is. All I'm concerned about this point is maximizing the yield from this slab and being able to extract as many body blanks as I can from it. So I just pick one end that has the least amount of checks in the end grain, and that's what I go with. Now I will admit I'm not the best with this bandsaw yet. Not used it a ton. There's certainly not as many hours on it as I would like. And I had, at this point in my ownership of this saw, I hadn't figured out how to set it up properly, both from the guide bearings as well as blade tension. I eventually did figure it out this year, and it's performing better than it ever has. And I've gotten a little bit better just technique as well. So definitely it's not always having the best tools, it's the technique that matters most. I'm really starting to get excited at this point. I love where the end grain landed in the center, about where the strap button was going to go, where the rings. This particular part of the slab just missed the pith of the slab, which is the center of the tree, which is definitely a weak point that would crack over time. So I didn't feel like I had anything to worry about there, but I was getting some nice quarter sawn in some parts of the body and then riff sawn in others. So now I'm trying to figure out how to flatten this thing. So I get my router sled out and recognize that it's too tall to get down to the body where I need it to be. So I end up ripping it on the table saw, and what I end up doing is I end up shimming up the body on my workbench and then securing it to the workbench with hot glue, and that held it perfect. So I got one side flat, now I flip it over and I do the other side. I gotta say, this particular router bit that I'm using, it's massive, and massive spinning things at 10,000 RPMs scare me. So definitely take your time with things like this. I know you probably have seen plenty of YouTube videos where people are using router sleds to flatten things. But just make sure your bit's tight, and make sure if you're using something like I'm using, which is a spoil board flattening bit with carbide squares, make sure those things are tight and Loctited in place before you start running that thing. So now I've got it flat. I'm taking it over to the other end of the workbench, and I'm using the number 5 jack plane to get rid of all the router bit marks. And then I switched to 80 grit sandpaper, and I'm using a pencil just to mark up the surface so I know which parts of the body I've hit and which I haven't, so that I can keep the sanding flat. Once I get all the pencil marks out and I get all of the hand plane marks out, then I'm ready to start template routing. So this is where that template comes into play. So I'm using a bunch of 2-sided tape to stick it down onto the body blank, and then I'm taking it over to the router table, and I use a couple of different router bits. First, I'm using a bottom bearing template routing bit to establish a reference point, because then I'm going to use a top bearing bit and flip the body over and route from that side, because I just don't have a wide enough router bit to get this all in one pass. And those things are expensive, especially get one of the nice fluted compression bits, one of the spiral ones. Those can be a couple $100. So I just use what I got, and it takes a little bit longer. And yeah, there's burning on the edges, but you know you're going to end up sanding that anyway. So now it's on to the oscillating spindle sander again, and much like I did the template, I'm just getting all of the router bit marks out and any burn marks from that dull router bit out of the side of the body. I actually have an excuse to take the belt off and put in a spindle to get on the inside of the horns and around the neck pocket. And here's what we're left with. So now I'm procrastinating because I don't feel like trying to figure out how to route the truss rod channel to the neck. I'm starting to try and mock up everything, and at this point I end up screwing things up, and I'm attempting to build a 35-inch scale base because I don't have one. My goal was to build something with Music Man pickups because I don't have anything on my bass rack that has that pickup configuration. And I want a 35-inch scale bass so I can do, drop tunings and still have string tension on the lower string. And at some point, I screw things up and end up making a 34-inch scale bass. I was going back and forth referencing 2 different instruments with 2 different scale lengths. I think when I did my final measurements, I just pulled the wrong bass. Or maybe I measured the scale length of the one I thought was 35 inches and not realizing it was actually 34. But if you hear me say I'm trying to build a 35-inch scale bass at some point throughout this build, this ends up being a 34-inch scale. So again, I'm not using any kind of store-bought templates. Every template that I do end up using is a template that I make myself. And like I said, I'm using existing instruments that I own to reference measurements off of, as far as bridge placement, pickup placement, things like that. And of course, scale length. Now I'm just taking that neck blank and I'm running it through the thickness planer just to get it down to the final thickness. Well, not really the final thickness. I'm just getting it perfectly flat on both sides at this point. Now I'm finding center for the truss rod, and I'm going to mark out where headstock's going to go, the nut's going to go, where the heel of the neck is going to go. So lots and lots of measurements, and double and triple and quadruple checking it. So I'm using I think this is a 24-inch truss rod from StewMac. It's a double action truss rod, so it'll bow it in both ways. And I'm going back and forth here with, do I want to use carbon fiber stiffening rods in this neck. And I'm voicing over this because I'm trying to like think my way through this. This is a 5-piece multi-laminate neck with maple and sapele. And ultimately the 5-piece maple neck, or the 5-piece laminate neck, makes it stronger than if it was a single piece. So being I'm going with a 4-string bass and it's not going to be a wider neck, I opt to not use the carbon fiber stiffening rods. But now I'm procrastinating cutting that router, cutting that truss rod channel, talking about and trying to think out how I want to lay out the actual body and the control plate and things like that. And actually, I'm waffling on what technique I'm going to use to route that truss rod channel. So I was going to use the router table, and then I remembered that I actually do have an edge guide for my router, my plunge router. It's a universal one, but that's what I ultimately end up going with because I want to be able to safely plunge the bit into the base. So again, I'm setting this up so that the access to the truss rod is going to come at the headstock end of the neck. I've just never understood ones that were hidden under pick guards, like the 73 Fender P-Bass that I have. You almost have to take a pick guard off to adjust the truss rod. And this, like, how do you adjust the truss rod and see if you're getting the relief right when there's no string tension on it? I know there's other ways to do it, but this particular one, I just decided to keep it simple and do a headstock access truss rod. So I'm taking it nice and slow. Fortunately, this truss rod is exactly a 1/4 inch, so I'm using a 1/4 inch router bit, and I do like 4 passes to get it down to the correct depth for the bulk of the truss rod. Now on the business end, the adjustment end is a bit thicker because there's plates that are welded, and of course the spot for the nut. So I opt to sharpen my chisels and kind of trace out where that needs to be wider and deeper, and just slowly creep up on it, and just a crap ton of back and forth because I want it to be tight, but I also want it to slide in and out smoothly with very little resistance. I just don't want any room for this thing to rattle when you're playing it. So I opted to take a lot of time to do this, and very slowly and incrementally, and just creep up on it and make sure that I got it perfectly flat, because obviously we got to glue the fretboard on top of it. And boom, there's my first truss rod installation. You see a little bit of daylight in spots, but that's because of the profile of the bottom of the truss rod. So now I need to start shaping the neck now that I got the truss rod channel routed in. I want to do that while I had parallel sides on it so I could use an edge guide or a fence on the router table. So that's why I hadn't cut the tapers into the neck or started shaping the headstock. So just like with the body, I'm going to start with a template. And while I got the table saw out, I'm going to cut off the ends and square off the ends, because I'm going to use those offcuts to actually glue onto the headstock end where it's not quite wide enough for the shape that I'm going to draw out. So I'm now just getting a couple of little pieces of sapele kind of sized up roughly. I'm jointing them by hand. I'm just using, again, a number 5 jack plane because this is such a small length of wood. I don't need to get my number 7 out for something like this. I just need it to be tight when I glue it up. So that's what I ended up having to do. Just glue a couple extra pieces on so that I could get the shape that I wanted. So I'm just scraping off any excess, making sure everything's perfectly flat so that when I put the template on, it sits perfectly flat. Now I'm marking center on this strip of MDF so that I can get just a solid center point to reference off of, and transferring some measurements that I drew onto the neck at key positions to kind of mark my taper. So I measured at the 12th fret, the 9th fret, the 1st fret, and this was a 24 fret instrument. So obviously the 24th fret and then the heel shape. So all that was measured out and marked on to the neck blank, and I'm just transferring all that out onto the template so that I can connect the dots and make my taper. And again, I'm just triple, quadruple checking because obviously this is a template and I need to get it right. So as you saw in the intro, I opted to go with a reverse fender style headstock. There's a couple of reasons for that design. One is not a whole lot of people do it, and two, from a string tensioning perspective, if you don't use a string tree, there's actually benefits tonally to having the longer string length on the bass string versus the treble string. So a Fender with the non-reverse headstock has the shortest string length on the lowest string, which kind of messes with the tension a little bit. So if you're looking at an E string on any Fender bass like this one that's I'm using to kind of rough out the headstock shape on, that E string is the first tuner you come to, so that's the shortest length. So I wanted to go reverse just so I'd have the longer string length on the E string and the shorter on the G. So it just makes for a little bit, in my opinion, a better string tension feel across the strings for the string that it's giving. So the longer the string length is, the higher you have to tension that one up to get to pitch, which means the lower strings are less floppy if you down tune. So if you want to do drop D or something like that on that bass that I'm building, it actually feels way better than on my Fender bass. So now I'm marking out the tuning pegs where they're going to land. I'm using some dividers to make sure I'm getting them all equidistant, but I'm also referencing how they're going to come off of the nut because I want them to be straight lines, and where that lands off of the nut is going to determine ultimately where the center of that string post is going to have to be for the tuner. So I'm following the taper of the neck off the bridge, given the string spacing I'm going to use, and that's telling me where I need to mark out the holes for the tuning pegs. Then I get the ferrules out and I use that to kind of mark in the actual size, so I can just make sure I'm happy with how everything's going to land. Now it's time to cut it out. So I'm just roughing it out on the bandsaw like you've seen me do every other step. Then I'm going to take it to the spindle sander, get it close. And then because I'm using this to actually do the profile of the neck, at least from the tapering standpoint, I actually want to make sure that's a very, very flat, straight line. And you can't really accomplish that on the oscillating spindle sander, so I end up taking a hand plane to that. So I use a hand plane, a precision straight edge, and a leveling beam to make sure that I get the edges of this neck template perfectly flat, perfectly straight, and perfectly level. Because ultimately that's what the neck is going to be referenced off of when I go to route out the shape. So now I take the truss rod out, put the template on, trace it out, and then I rough it out on the bandsaw. This is ultimately where I'm going to leave it once I get it roughed out because I have just some decisions to make at that point on what fretboard material I'm going to use, what color I'm going to do on the body. So I start playing around with a bunch of stuff, and you'll see that to kick off the next episode, and probably see some options that I had that you would have liked better than what I ended up going with, which is totally fine. All right, back to the router table. This time I have a bit that does reach all the way. But I always like to reference that first cut with the template side down because I know that's perfectly flat. So I go back and forth between a top and a bottom bearing bit.
All right, thank you so much for watching this first episode in the build series of this bass guitar. It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure, and stressful and just troublesome and problematic, all those things wrapped up into one throughout this entire process. But it's been really, really interesting to start going back through this footage a year later as I get ready to do my next custom build. Yeah, I get to see all the mistakes that I made, hopefully learn how to mitigate some of those mistakes. But yeah, I definitely feel like I've gotten bit by the custom build bug, and I think I'm going to be doing quite a few of these. Thanks for joining me down here in the basement.